Chapter 30, page 363. "Mr. Arthur, honey," said Atticus, gently correcting me. "Jean Louise, this is Mr. Arthur Radley. I believe he already knows you." If Atticus could blandly introduce me to Boo Radley at a time like this, well, that was Atticus. Boo saw me running instinctively to the bed where Jim was sleeping, for the same shy smile crept across his face. Hot with embarrassment, I tried to cover Jim up. "Don't touch him," Atticus said. Mr. Heck Tate sat looking intently at Boo through his horn-rimmed glasses. He was about to speak when Dr. Reynolds came down the hall. "Everybody out," he said. He came to the door. "Evening, Arthur. Didn't notice you the first time I was here." Dr. Reynolds' voice was as breezy as his step, as though he had said it every evening of his life, an announcement that astounded me even more than being in the same room as Boo Radley. Of course, even Boo Radley gets sick sometimes, I thought, but on the other hand, I wasn't sure. Dr. Reynolds was carrying a big package wrapped in newspaper. He put it down on Jim's desk and he took off his coat. "You're quite satisfied he's alive now?" "I'll tell you how I knew. When I tried to examine him, he kicked me. Had to put him out good and proper to touch him. 'So scat,' he said to me." "Oh," said Atticus, glancing at Boo. "Heck, let's go out on the porch. There are plenty of chairs out there. It's still warm enough." I wondered why Atticus was inviting us to the front porch instead of the living room, and then I understood. The living room lights were awfully strong. We filed out. Mr. Tate, Atticus was waiting at the door for him to go ahead, and then he changed his mind and he followed Mr. Tate. People, they have a habit of doing everyday things even under the oddest conditions. I was no exception. "Come along, Mr. Arthur," I heard myself saying. "You don't know the house real well, so I'll just take you to the porch, sir." He looked down at me and nodded. I led him down the hall and past the living room. "Won't you have a seat, Mr. Arthur? This rocking chair is nice and comfortable." My small fantasy about him was alive again. He'd be sitting on the porch. "Right pretty spell we're having, isn't it, Mr. Arthur?" "Yes, right pretty spell." Feeling slightly unreal, I led him to the chair farthest from Atticus and Mr. Tate. It was in a deep shadow. Boo would feel more comfortable in the dark. Atticus was sitting in the swing, and Mr. Tate was in the chair next to him, and the light from the living room window was strong on them. I sat beside Boo. "Well, Heck," Atticus says, "I guess the thing to do—" Good Lord, I'm losing my memory. Atticus pushed his glasses up, and he pressed his fingertips to his eyes. "Jim's not quite 13. No, he's already 13. I can't remember. Anyway, it'll come from county court." "What will, Mr. Finch?" Mr. Tate uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. "Well, of course it was clear-cut self-defense, but I'll have to go to the office and hunt up—" "Mr. Finch, do you think Jim killed Bob Ewell?" "Do you think that?" "Well, you heard what Scout said. There was no doubt about it. She said Jim got up and he yanked her off. He probably got hold of Ewell's knife somehow in the dark. We'll find out tomorrow." "Mr. Finch, hold on," said Mr. Tate. "Jim never stabbed Miss Bob Ewell." Atticus was silent for a moment. He looked at Mr. Tate as if he appreciated what he said, but Atticus shook his head. "Heck, that's mighty kind of you. I know you're doing it from that good heart of yours, but don't start anything like that." Mr. Tate got up and he went to the edge of the porch. He spat into the shrubbery, and then he thrust his hands into his hip pockets and he faced Atticus. "Like what?" he said. "I'm sorry if I spoke sharply, Heck," Atticus said simply, "but nobody's hushing this up. I don't live that way." "Well, nobody's going to hush up anything, Mr. Finch." Mr. Tate's voice was quiet, but his boots were planted so solidly on the porch floorboards it seemed that they grew there. A curious contest, the nature of which eluded me, and was developing between my father and the sheriff. It was Atticus's turn to get up and go to the edge of the porch, and he said, and spat dryly into the yard. He put his hand in his pocket. He faced Mr. Tate. "Heck, you haven't said it, but I know what you're thinking, and I thank you for it. Jean Louise, he turned to me. You said that Jem yanked Yule off you. Well, yes, sir, that's what I thought. You see there, Heck? Thank you from the bottom of my heart, but I don't want my boy starting out with something like this over his head. Well, the best way to clear the air is to have it all out in the open. Let the country come and bring sandwiches. I just don't want him growing up with a whisper about him. I don't want anybody saying Jim Finch, his daddy paid a mint to get him out of that. Sooner we get it over with, the better. Mr. Finch, Mr. Tate said stolidly. Bob Ewell fell on his knife. He killed himself. Atticus walked to the corner of the porch. He looked at the wisteria vine. In his own way, I thought each was as stubborn as the other. I wondered who would give in first. Atticus's stubbornness was quiet and rarely evident, but in some ways he was as set as the Cunninghams. Mr. Tate's was unschooled and blunt, and it was equal to my father's. Heck, Atticus' back was turned. If this thing's hushed up, it'll be a simple denial to Jem of the way that I have tried to raise him. Sometimes I think I'm a total failure as a parent, but I'm all they've got. Before Jem looked at anybody else, he looks at me, and I've tried to live so I can look him squarely back. If I connived at something like this, frankly, I couldn't meet his eye. And the day I can't do that, I'll know I've lost him. And I don't want to lose him and Scout, because they're all I've got. Mr. Finch, Mr. Tate was still planted on the floorboards. Bob Ewell fell on his knife. I can prove it. Atticus wheeled around, his hands dug into his pocket. Heck, can't you even try to see it my way? You've got children of your own, but I'm older than you. When mine are grown, I'll be an old man if I'm still around, but right now if they don't trust me, then they won't trust anybody. Jim and Scout know what happened. If they hear me saying downtown something different happened, heck, I won't have them anymore. I can't live one way in town and another way in my house. Mr. Tate rocked on his heels and said patiently, he'd flung Jem down. He stumbled over a root under that tree. And look, I can show you how. Mr. Tate reached in his side pocket and withdrew a long switchblade knife. As he did so, Dr. Reynolds came to the door. The deceased under the tree. Doctor, just inside the schoolyard. Got a flashlight? Better have this one. I can ease around and turn my car lights on, said Dr. Reynolds, but he took Mr. Tate's flashlight. Jem's all right. He won't wake up tonight. I hope, so don't worry. That the knife that killed him, Hank? No, sir. Still in him. Looks like a kitchen knife from the handle. Ken ought to be here with a hearse by now. Good night. Mr. Tate flicked open the knife. It was like this, he said. He held the knife and pretended to stumble, and as he leaned forward, his left arm went down in front of him. See there? He stumbled himself through the soft stuff beneath his ribs. His whole weight drove it in. Mr. Tate closed the knife and jammed it in his pocket. Scout is 8 years old, he said. She was too scared to know exactly what went on. You'd be surprised, Atticus said grimly. I am not saying that she made it up. I'm saying she was too scared to know exactly what happened. It was mighty dark out there, black as ink, and somebody'd be mighty used to dark to make a competent witness. I won't have it, Atticus said softly. God damn it, I am not thinking of Jim. Mr. Tate's boot hit the floorboard so hard the lights in Miss Maudie's bedroom went on. Miss Stephanie Crawford's lights went on. Atticus and Mr. Tate looked across the street and then at each other, and they waited. When Mr. Tate spoke again, he was barely audible. Mr. Finch, I hate to fight you when you're like this. You've been under a strain tonight no man should have ever had to go through. And why you ain't in bed from it, I do not know, but I do know that for once you haven't been able to put two and two together, and we've got to settle this tonight because tomorrow it'll be too late. Bob Ewell got a kitchen knife in his craw. Mr. Tate added that Atticus wasn't going to stand there and maintain that any boy Jem-sized with a busted arm and had fight enough lead in him to tackle and kill a grown man in pitch dark. Heck, Atticus said abruptly. There was a switchblade you were waving. Where'd you get it? Took it off a drunk man. Sit, Mr. Tate answered coolly. I was trying to remember. Mr. Ewell was on me, and then he went down. Jim must have gotten up. At least I thought. Heck. I said I took it off a drunk man downtown tonight. Ewell probably found that kitchen knife in the dump somewhere, honed it down, and bided his time. Just bided his time. Atticus made his way to the swing, and he sat down. His hands dangled limply between his knees. He was looking at the floor. He'd moved with the same slowness that night in front of the jail when I thought it took him forever to fold his paper and toss it in his chair. Mr. Tate clumped softly around the porch. It ain't your decision, Mr. Finch. It's all mine. It's my decision. It's my responsibility. And for once, if you don't see it my way, well, there's just not much you can do about it. If you want to try, I'll call you a liar to your face. Your boy never stabbed Ewell, he said slowly. Didn't come near a mile of it, and now you know. All he wanted to do was get home and get his sister home safe. Mr. Tate stopped pacing. He stopped in front of Atticus, and his back was to us. I'm not a very good man, sir, but I am sheriff at Macomb County. I lived in this town all my life, and I'm going on 43 years old. Know everything that's happened ever since I was born. Now there's a black boy dead for no reason, and the man responsible for it's dead. Just let the dead bury the dead this time, Mr. Finch. Let the dead bury the dead. Mr. Tate went to the swing and he picked up his hat. It was lying beside Atticus. Mr. Tate pushed back his hair, and he put on his hat. I never heard telling that it's against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime from being committed, which is exactly what he did. But maybe you'll say that it's my duty to tell the town all about it and not hush it up. Well, you know what'll happen then? All the ladies in Macomb, including my wife, be knocking on his door bringing angel food cakes. To my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking one man who's done you and this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, well, to me that's a sin. It's a sin, and I am not about to have it on my head. If it was any other man, it'd be different, but this is not any other man, Mr. Finch. Mr. Tate was trying to dig a hole in the floor with the toe of his boot. He pulled his nose, and then he massaged his left arm. I may not be much, Mr. Finch, but I am still sheriff of Macomb County, and Bob Ewell fell on his knife. A good night, sir. Mr. Tate stamped off the floorboard and strode across the front yard. His door slammed, and he drove away. Atticus sat looking at the floor for a long time, and finally he raised his head. Scout, he said, Mr. Ewell fell on his knife. Can you possibly understand? Atticus looked like he needed cheering up. I ran at him and I hugged him and kissed him with all my might. Yes, sir, I understand, I reassured him, and Mr. Tate was right. Atticus disengaged himself and he looked at me. What do you mean? Well, be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? Atticus put his face in my hair and he rubbed it. And when he got up and he walked across the porch into the shadows, his youthful step had returned. Before he went inside the house, he stopped in front of Boo Radley. Thank you for my children, Arthur, he said. One more chapter left. We're going to jump right into it. Chapter 31, page 371. When Boo Radley shuffled his feet, light from the living room windows glistened on his forehead. Every move he made was uncertain, as if he were not sure his hands and feet could make proper contact with the things he touched. He coughed his dreadful, railing cough, and he was so shaken he had to sit down again. His hand searched for his hip pocket, and he pulled out a handkerchief. He coughed into it, and then he wiped his forehead. Having been so accustomed to his absence, I found it incredible that he'd been sitting beside me all this time, present. He'd not made a sound. Once more he got to his feet. He turned to me and nodded toward the front door. You'd like to say goodbye to Jim, wouldn't you? Mr. Arthur, you come right in. I led him down the hall. Aunt Alexandra was sitting by Jim's bed. Come in, Arthur, she said. He's still asleep. Dr. Reynolds gave him a heavy sedative. Jean Louise, is your father in the living room? Yes, ma'am, I think so. Well, I'll just go speak to him a minute. Dr. Reynolds left some, and her voice trailed away. Boo had drifted to a corner of the room where he stood with his chin up, peering from a distance at Jim. I took him by a hand surprisingly warm for its whiteness. I tugged him a little, and he allowed me to lead him to Jim's bed. Dr. Reynolds had made a tent-like arrangement over Jim's arm to keep the cover off, I guess, and Boo leaned forward and he looked it over. An expression of timid curiosity was on his face, as though he'd never seen a boy before. His mouth was slightly open, and he looked at Jim from head to toe. Boo's hand came up, but he let it drop to his side. Oh, you can pet him, Mr. Arthur. He's asleep. You couldn't if he was awake, though. He wouldn't let you. I found myself explaining. You go ahead. Boo's hand hovered over Jim's head. Go on, sir. He's asleep. His hand came down lightly on Jim's hair. I was beginning to learn his body English. His hand tightened on mine, and he indicated that he wanted to leave. I led him to the porch, where his uneasy steps halted. He was still holding my hand, and he gave no sign of letting go. Will you take me home? He almost whispered, in the voice of a child afraid of the dark. I put my foot on the top step and stopped. I would lead him through our house, but I would never lead him home. Mr. Arthur, bend your arm. Down here, like that. Yeah, that's right, sir. And I slipped my hand in the crook of his arm. He had to stoop a little to accommodate me, but if Miss Stephanie Crawford was watching from her upstairs window, she would see Arthur Radley escorting me down the sidewalk, as any gentleman would do. We came to the street light on the corner, and I wonder how many times Dill had stood there hugging that fat pole, watching and waiting and hoping. I wondered how many times Jim and I had made this journey, but I entered the Boo Radley front gate for the second time in my life. Boo and I walked up the stairs of the porch. His fingers found the doorknob. He gently released my hand, opened the door, went inside, shut the door behind him. I never saw him again. Neighbors bring food with death and flowers with sickness, the little things in between. Boo was our neighbor. He gave us 2 soap dolls and a broken watch chain and a pair of good luck pennies and our lives. But neighbors give in return. We never put back into the tree what we took out of it. We'd given it nothing. It made me sad. I turned to go home. Street lights winked down the street all the way to town. I'd never seen our neighborhood from this angle. There was Miss Maudie's, Miss Stephanie's. There was our house. I could see the porch swing. Miss Rachel's house was behind us, plainly visible. I could see even Mrs. Du Bois's. I looked behind me. To the left of the brown door was a long shuttered window. I walked it. I stood in front of it. I turned around. In daylight, I thought, you could see the post office corner. Daylight. And in my mind, the night faded. It was daylight, and the neighborhood was busy. Miss Stephanie Crawford crossed the street to tell the latest to Miss Rachel. Miss Stephanie bent over her azaleas. It was summer, and 2 children scampered down the sidewalk toward a man approaching in the distance. The man waved, and the children raced to see him. It was still summer, and the children came closer. A boy trudged along the sidewalk, dragging a fishing pole behind him. A man stood, waiting with his hands on his hips. Summertime, his children played in the front yard with their friend and acted a strange little drama of their own invention. It was fall, and his children fought on the sidewalk in front of Mrs. Du Bois's house. The boy helped his sister to her feet, and they made their way home. Fall, and his children trotted to and from the corner, the day's woes and triumphs on their faces. They stopped in an oak tree, delighted, puzzled, apprehensive. Winter and his children shivered at the front gate, silhouetted against a blazing house. Winter and a man walked into the street, dropped his glasses, and shot a doll. Summer, and he watched his children's heart break. Autumn again, and Boo's children needed him. Atticus was right. One time, he said, you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. The street lights were fuzzy from the fine rain that was falling, and as I made my way home I felt very odd, but when I looked at the tip of my nose I could see a fine mist, beads, but looking cross-eyed made me dizzy, so I quit. As I made my way home I thought, what a thing to tell Jim tomorrow. He'd be so mad that he missed it, he wouldn't speak to me for days. And as I made my way home, I thought Jim and I would be grown, but there wasn't much else left for us to learn, except possibly algebra. I ran up the steps and into the house. Aunt Alexandra had gone to bed, and Atticus's room was dark. I would see if Jim might be revived. Atticus was in Jim's room, sitting by his bed. He was reading a book. Is Jim awake yet? Sleeping peacefully. He won't be awake until morning. Oh, are you sitting up with him? Just for an hour or so. Go on to bed, Scout. You've had a long day. Well, I think I'll stay with you for a while. Suit yourself, said Atticus. It must have been after midnight, and I was puzzled by his amiable acquisition. He was shrewder than I, however. The moment I sat down, I began to feel sleepy. What you reading? I asked. Atticus turned the book over. Something of Jim's called The Gray Ghost, and I was suddenly awake. Why'd you get that one? Honey, I don't know. I just picked it up. One of the few things I haven't read, he said pointedly. Read it out loud, please, Atticus. It's real scary. No, said Atticus. You've had enough scaring for the night. Wow, this is too. Atticus, I wasn't scared. He raised his eyebrows and I protested. Leastways not till I started telling Mr. Tate about it. Jim wasn't scared. I asked him and he said he wasn't. Besides, nothing's real scary except in books. Atticus opened his mouth to say something, but shut it again. He took his thumb from the middle of the page and he turned back to the first page. I moved over and I leaned my head against his knee. He said. The Gray Ghost by Secretary Hawkins, Chapter 1. I willed myself to stay awake, but the rain was so soft, and the room was so warm, and his voice was so deep, and his knee was so snug that I slept. Seconds later, it seemed, his shoe was gently nudging my ribs. He lifted me to my feet and walked me to my room. I heard every word you said, I muttered. I wasn't sleeping at all. It's about Shib and Three-Fingered Fred and Stoner Boy. He unhooked my overalls, leaned me against him, and pulled them off. He put me up on one hand, and he reached for my pajamas with the other. Yeah, and they all thought it was Stoner's boy messing up their clubhouse and throwing ink and all over in it. He guided me to the bed, and he sat me down. He lifted my legs, and he put me under the covers. And they chased him, and he never could catch him because they didn't know where he looked like. And Atticus, when they finally saw him, why, he hadn't done any of those things. Atticus, he was real nice. His hands were under my chin, pulling up the covers, tucking me in. Most people are, Scout, when you finally get to know them, and when you finally see them. He turned out the light and he went to Jim's room. He would be there all night, and he would be there when Jim woke up in the morning. The end. And the lights went out just as I read. You don't know until you stand in someone else's shoes. That's exactly what Scout did, standing there on Boo's porch. Well, we're going to come back to a recap of this book. Do not forget to be taking your chapter quizzes. And we are done. Except for the recap, except for a test, and except for a minor added assignment. I will see you soon.